being a Hill Institute student singing in their language.
Yes.
So maybe for the intermission.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. You know, you have to. There's no chairperson, so you have to just. Yeah. No. No chair. So you just kind of introduce. No, the thing is, we started late, and then we had a lot of technical. So even while we were ready, we had a lot of things to fix and things. So we kind of went late. Good morning.
So you don't need to project. This.
It's all right, hang on, let's have a look. Yeah, it's HDMI in there. Hang on, let me just. Can I just? Yeah, just quickly. And it should go. Okay, hang on. No signal. I can't. It's not getting any signal.
Yes. Is it morning, afternoon? What time is it? 11:51. Okay, good morning everyone. We are still in the morning session. And I think we are just about ready to get into the third session for the conference. This session would run for just about an hour. We are running a little behind schedule, and I know that we have had a wonderful morning so far, so we'll just continue into these very exciting presentations. Now we are expected to have 3 presentations during this time. And what I will do, I will introduce our first presenter, Professor Esther Nunez, who is going to present her paper on Garifuna Enduring Spirit in St. Vincent, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, Nicaragua, and the United States. Professor Nunez was born in Dangriga, Belize, Central America, and has lived in New York City since her early teens. Professor Nunez received her bachelor's degree from Medgar Evers College of the City University of New York in 1997. She proceeded to work at Manhattan offices of the Harlem Children's Zone as a program coordinator for the after-school program, providing to youth in Harlem while challenging them to perform at optimal standards in their pursuit of academic excellence. She graduated with dual master's degrees in social science in 2004 and a second master's degree in political science in 2006 from the Social Science, Political Science, and United Studies at Long Island University. In September 2006, Professor Nunez began teaching at Medgar Evers College, the City University of New York. She is currently pursuing her PhD studies in interdisciplinary studies in culture society. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Nunez.
Bitu Binafi. Buenos dias, Senor y Senores. Greetings and welcome. Gananiti sunkateya ubawago. Shiluhalida luwayanuha luwag kasi serebeya yurume. There's a time. What I'm saying is, there is a time for everything under the sun. Until the hunter tell his story, the hunter's story will always be glorified. History will never reveal your glory. I am here to deconstruct the lies and tell our story. I am a Garifuna. It means cassava eating people. History stated that the Garifuna was from West Africa. The Igbo, the Ashanti, and the Yoruba. To make the linguistic connection, Inubu cassava is named Gari. It's this cassava that sustained us throughout our Garifuna journey. Even in the most sacred ritual, the Dogo, it is a cassava that our ancestors request. Not pepper pot from Haiti, not black rice, not eba from Nigeria, but rather, and not Kentucky Fried, but rather, it is the cassava. Our story is one of resistance, one of struggle, and one of survival. Our story initially started on the Orinoco River. The Carib, the Arawak. The Carib, the Arawak will launch trade on the Iraq and take their women as wives. Hence, that was the beginning of two culture, a hybrid of culture, the Garifuna and the Arawak. There are two different perspectives in regards to the Garifuna. Ivan Van Sertima stated that before Columbus, Africans and the Native American Aborigine had cultural exchange. That was maybe the beginning of the Garifuna culture. Base, theory, hypothesis from Ivan Van Sertima. The Garifuna story started in 1638. There were slaves coming out of West Africa. Supposed to be, that's one theory. These slaves began to interact with Native American, hence merge our culture. But on this island of St. Vincent was political insurrection, political instability. Joseph Paramount, Chief Chataway, was our leader. Finally, we fought with the French. We fought with the Spaniards. But finally, it was the British that conquered the Garifuna people. After Joseph Paramount, Chief Chataway, he was assassinated. His son Duvalier took on the Garifuna warfare. Eventually, after 2 years, we surrendered. We were placed on this island of Balisau. And on this island of Balisau, the Garifuna people died of starvation. They died of dysentery. They died of forced abortion. Eventually, the Garifuna people were forced exiled to Honduras, to Rotan, and later on to Belize. As the Garifuna community people had entered different society in Honduras, in Guatemala, and in Belize, the Garifuna people were marginalized. They were disenfranchised. As we speak today in Belize, we are still marginalized. We are still disenfranchised. In Honduras, we are still marginalized, and we're still disenfranchised in Honduras. In New York, Garifuna people are dispersed out to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, but yet still, we are still marginalized wherever we are in the diaspora. Only here in St. Vincent, whereby I have first felt, for the first time, freedom as a Garifuna. Because for the past 200 years, my sisters had been dispossessed as a people. And here I am home, on my ancestral homeland. And for the first time, I am tasting freedom as a Garifuna. I was here last summer with my contingency from New York. I was very emotional in regards to our journey to Balisau, to reconnect with the spirit of my ancestors. And one of my contingents said to me, "Don't cry." "Why are you crying?" "I'm crying because I felt the spirit of the ancestors, whereby this is where the atrocities had occurred. Atrocities in terms of forced abortion, starvation. It was like they were entering a door of no return. Where are we going to go? But my ancestors, because of their resilience, that we are still here as Garifuna people. If it wasn't for the resilience of my ancestors as Garifuna, we would have been decimated, wiped out, genocide. And today, United Nations has claimed Garifuna culture a masterpiece, an oral and intangible masterpiece to humanity. And because of that, I am proud of my Garifuna journey, because we, as the people, I finally acknowledge. I say to you tonight, I say to you today, long live Garifuna. And power to Garifuna. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nunes. And we would have our second presenter. We will do all of our presentations, and afterwards we would have questions. Our second presenter is Chanel Charles, and she is presenting to us on the topic, what connects us, Indigenous peoples of the Anglophone Caribbean. Chanel Charles is a Guyanese of Afro-Guyanese and Indigenous Lucano parentage. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in History from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in 2011, and obtained a Master of Arts degree in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from the University of Guelph in 2013. While pursuing her master's degree at the University of Guelph, she worked as a research assistant and served as a board member for the Ontario Public Interest Research Group, Guelph. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in history at the University of Toronto, and her research to date has mainly focused on Indigenous experiences and Indigenous mobilization in the post-independence period of Guyana. Chanella has worked as the research coordinator for the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the study of Aboriginal cultures and as a teaching assistant at the University of Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you PhD candidate Chanel Charles.
Okay, bear with me while I try to find. If not, you can just go on without it. We can go. Okay, so we have some technical difficulties, but as everybody has been saying for the rest of, for the morning, the show must go on. So we're always prepared. So the title of my presentation, Indigenous Peoples of the Anglophone Caribbean, is more in terms of framing it in a historical context, even though that term is problematic, to refer to specifically countries that were colonized by the British and where English is now the main language. So when we think of the Caribbean, and I had on the slides and definitions of the Caribbean to also include the circum-Caribbean countries like Suriname, Guyana, Belize. A lot of times people would tell me I'm Guyanese, that you're not really Caribbean. But our history and culture would prove otherwise. So we are linked, Indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, by similar historical, cultural, and political circumstances. And as mentioned in previous presentations, until recently, narratives of Indigenous disappearance dominated scholarly discourse. And I want to highlight, even though that I am in academia, that Indigenous communities have been central to challenging these narratives by asserting their presence and forming interregional networks that focus on the main issues that Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean face. So while there is this scholarship that is now, becoming more available, Indigenous peoples themselves have been working together for a long time. So I am at a conference presenting about conferences. So Indigenous conferences are one of the main avenues that Indigenous communities and organizations use to make connections. Now this presentation will focus on two key regional conferences that were held in the latter part of the 20th century. And these conferences illuminate the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples in this region. And in order to fully understand these challenges, they will be placed into historical context to highlight why the histories of Indigenous peoples are important. So the first conference that I'm going to highlight is the one that occurred in 1987 right here in St. Vincent. I believe we have at least one person who was here today. So at that time, a lot of the Caribbean countries were newly independent. There were historical, cultural, economic, and political circumstances that made them come together to discuss issues of concern. So this gathering was known as the Conference of Indigenous Peoples of the Caribbean, and it was held at the Haddon Hotel right here in St. Vincent. And you'll see a reoccurrence in these conference themes, similar words. The theme of this conference was Caribbean Indigenous Revival towards greater recognition and development. And there were representatives from St. Vincent, the host country, Dominica, Guyana, Belize, and Canada. In her opening remarks, chairperson of the National Planning Committee, Alida Derek Cordes, stated that, and I quote, "Unfortunately, we have lost our heritage and culture, and somewhere along the way, many of us have lost our pride of being Carib Indians. Today, we find many who are even ashamed of their identity. This is a disgrace among us and can be corrected by training our young people about our strong and independent history." So her remarks aptly sum up the shared experiences of Indigenous peoples. We share a history of loss and marginalization, but we also share a history of resistance and resilience, as everybody's presentation has highlighted thus far. Now, this conference itself can be considered as a part of this history of resistance and resilience, as it highlights the refusal to accept loss and the assertion of our presence in the Caribbean. It provided an avenue for Indigenous peoples to share their various experiences and deepen bonds and contacts among Indigenous communities in the Caribbean. So what connects us? What were some of the common issues discussed at this conference? So some of the common issues were land title and tenure, economic unavailability, political underrepresentation, lack of basic health facilities, lack of preparation among youth for increasing unequal distribution of opportunities in the newly formed nation states, racism on the part of the dominant groups. However, in the interest of time, I will focus specifically on two of those points, land and racism. Now, in order to understand the true nature of these issues, it is important to place them into historical context, because land and title tenure are issues that are directly linked to the usurpation of Indigenous land during the colonial period. So throughout history, peoples have fought to defend their lands. So I'm going to be repeating some of what people already said, but I believe you can't overemphasize this history. So using St. Vincent and Guyana as an example to speak about land and racism. So during the 16th and 17th centuries, St. Vincent was one of the last strongholds of the people of Spanish called Caribs, a corruption of the Indigenous word Kalinago. It is also the source of the term Carib, Caribbean, and cannibal. Enslaved Africans came to the island via shipwrecks, marriage, and Kalinago raids on European settlements. Out of the relations between Kalinago and Africans merged the people who the British called Black Caribs, today known as the Garifuna. The Garifuna retained a high degree of independence from colonial control until the British formally acquired treaty rights, or at least in European eyes, to St. Vincent from the French in 1763. After Britain was awarded St. Vincent by the treaty with the French, the Garifuna struggle to maintain their independence intensified. French planters, traders, and missionaries had become established on the part of the island in the early 1700s, but the Garifuna managed to retain considerable political and territorial autonomy while interacting extensively with the French and the wider Caribbean. British planters sought to expand sugar production in St. Vincent, and the contest for land and authority led to a series of conflicts between the British and the Garifuna. In 1773, the Garifuna were forced to acknowledge British rule, but a French-Garifuna alliance gained control over the island between 1779 and 1783. Thereafter, the British regained control of the island. The Garifuna rose once more in the mid-1790s, allying with the French. The British defeated the resistance after a bloody conflict. Colonial officials and planters successfully lobbied the British imperial government to remove the, quote, Black Caribs, portraying them as having usurped the customs and identity of, quote, pure Indians, and labeled them, quote, Red Caribs or Yellow Caribs. Thus, they had used blackness as a weapon to deny the Garifuna indigenous status on the island. So, consequently, of the 4,338 Garifuna captured in 1796, only 2,026 survived their internment and journey to arrive in Central America in 1797. The desperate and famished survivors of war were interned on a waterless island called Baliso. Finally, in March 1799, the remnants of the Garifuna nation were transported in British ships 17,000 miles away northwest, where they were deposited on the Spanish-controlled island of Ratán off the coast of Honduras. So, in terms of how we get to this question of land in 1987, that highlights the Garifuna experience. In terms of highlighting the case of Guyana, again, we have the British taking people's land. At the dawn of the 19th century, the British would gain control of Guyana from the Dutch. So they had what they would term friendly policies, and the motives behind these friendly policies were neither altruistic or humanitarian, but rather pragmatic and expedient. There were two reasons why the maintenance of good relations with indigenous peoples was necessary. So, first, the guarding of the borders of the colony was to be done by them, and they were to assist in keeping the enslaved population under control. The policy of giving presents would be continued until the 1860s, when the British deemed it unnecessary and a financial burden to the colony. Thus, it is revealing that the once inexpensive practice would become a financial burden once indigenous peoples were of no immediate importance to the government. So now in the post-emancipation period, the British policy towards indigenous peoples would shift, and their need for cooperation declined. So they were no longer economically useful, as internal threat to slave rebellions no longer existed. During the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the government essentially pursued the policy of neglect. They decided that indigenous peoples would be civilized through Christianity. So we see the theme of Christianity as a tool of colonization. And consequently, churches were able to assert their presence more strongly in indigenous communities. It is in this period the social status of indigenous peoples declined. In the 20th century, the state shifted to a combined policy of protection and integration. The social status of indigenous peoples further deteriorated during this period. In 1910, the number 28 Aboriginal Ordinance was passed in an effort to define the rights, privileges, and duties of indigenous peoples. The 1910 Ordinance empowered the government to declare any portion of occupied land as a reservation, and he could de-reserve areas for resource extraction. Indigenous people had to get permission to leave the reservation, and the employment of indigenous people had to be approved by the protector of the Indians. And this would remain in effect until 1951, and aspects of the 1951 then Amerindian Act would become the 1975 Amerindian Act, which, although land settlement of land rights was made informal condition for independence, and with the consultation of the communities, they had, well, it's strange to say they requested, because it's their own land, they requested 24,000 square miles, and Guyana is 83,000 square miles. With the 1975 Act, they were only given 4,500 square miles. So that is the context for the land issues that would have arisen amongst the countries that would have met for that conference. In terms of racism, which is very much related to what we talked about today and how Indigenous peoples are viewed, one of the comments made at the conference was that Indigenous peoples are viewed as second-class citizens, subhuman. Indigenous peoples have been portrayed as subhuman and uncivilized throughout the course of history. For example, the origins of the word Carib and in the context of Guyana, buck are directly related to the histories of indigenous dispossession. Previously, in Caribbean historiography, the binary of Arawak versus Carib was predominant. The peaceful Arawaks versus the warlike and cannibalistic Caribs. Today we know they were called Caribs not because they would eat human flesh, because this myth has been debunked, but because they defended their homes. By labeling indigenous peoples Caribs, colonial powers were able to usurp indigenous lands by declaring war against the people they termed to be savages. So within the context of Guyana, I'm not sure, there might be some Guyanese here. So today in Guyana, it's common for people to refer to indigenous people as bucks. So in terms of looking at the context of this word and its history, according to Guyanese historian Menezes, the term bucks was used by Colonel Hillsop to designate Indians and was used continuously by the English throughout the 19th century. The word is still used in a derogatory manner. Not only is it used to denote someone of indigenous descent, but it is also used to refer to someone who is believed to be lacking intellectual capacity. Hence, the word buck has become synonymous with stupidity in Guyana. The origin of this word seems to rest with the Dutch. In a Dutch document written from the colonies to the Prince of Orange in July 1790, one reads, "The colonies of Essequibo and Demerara, there are Indians or Buchan. This Buchan became bucks. The Dutch translation for buck imitates a wild or nimble animal. The Dutch apparently saw these attributes personified indigenous peoples and thus dubbed them Buchan." So in the documents featured in the document History of Amerindians, they describe indigenous persons as, and I quote, "Their bony structure, although well covered with muscles, slender, and denotes rather agility and indolence rather than strength and activity." So there's where the notion of the lazy indigenous person comes into being. So there are also references in books relating to intellectual capacity of indigenous peoples. So there is a quote comparing indigenous peoples to the rest of the Guyanese population, published in 1881, and I quote, "The origin of Guyana Indians ascertained, or Aborigines of America. Socially and culturally, the Europeans classified them as simple but interesting Dizians of the forest, and the perfect, ignorant, and untamed savage." Similar sentiments are echoed in the forgotten tribes of Guyana. They are essentially a peaceable, likable, and kindly people, shy, modest, and wary to approach Western influence and ways of life. They are easily gulled and misled, which is one of their misfortunes. So that provides some background for how indigenous peoples are viewed not only because of colonization, but also historiography that I say we because I'm a historian in training, are guilty of perpetuating in terms of how we frame Caribbean history. So in terms of highlighting the second gathering, and this gathering is significant because it was held in 1993. It was in Trinidad and Tobago, and the theme was survival, recognition, and reparation. So we see a lot of words and becoming familiar as we continually try, to get the recognition that we deserve. So 1993 was declared the year of the world's indigenous people by the United Nations. And it was felt that the declaration provided an ideal opportunity to hold the gathering of indigenous peoples. It was held in the Santa Rosa Carib community. Now we call the community the Santa Rosa First Peoples community. The countries that participated included host country Trinidad, Guyana, Dominica, Belize, and St. Vincent. The main concerns of the conference were art and culture, struggle for recognition and survival, women's issues, researches and indigenous intellectual property rights, and economic underdevelopment. So I'm going to focus on art and culture and looking at what connects us. So in the conference, Lauren Pierre of the Amerindian Research Unit of Guyana asserted that it is clear that the subject of art and culture could be a linchpin in the present survival and future of indigenous people. So art and culture are very important to indigenous conceptions of self. I'm sure many of you would have seen the exhibitions, and even when I travel in between Caribbean countries, there's always that familiarity that I feel as expressed when I view indigenous art and culture in terms of whether it's weaving, pottery, etc. So while aspects in terms of material culture to some extent have survived, language is one aspect, as a few of the presenters remarked on, that has suffered as a result of colonization. And I mentioned Christianization was used as a tool of colonization previously, early in my paper. So it was used to civilize indigenous people, and I would like to highlight the role of the church that would expand to include education in indigenous communities, and this meant that Western ideas and languages would become the main focus in indigenous communities. So now there is a late John Bennett who devoted 20 years of his life compiling a Arawak dictionary. So even in his experiences, recounting his childhood, like some of the experiences of other indigenous peoples from other communities, he would recall being punished for speaking his language. And this was a common practice in indigenous communities in Guyana, particularly the ones close to the coast, which were the first to come in contact with European settlers. So these experiences contributed not only to the loss of language, but it also contributed to the shame that indigenous people felt in embracing their culture. It contributed to a loss of identity. And these are some of the things that commonly affected all of the indigenous participants at the conference. So in terms of reflecting on other aspects of where we are now, as many people have mentioned in their presentation, there is a lot of continuity post-independence. There are a lot of policies that mirror some of the colonial policies. There's a lot of language that mirror colonial language in how indigenous peoples are viewed and how policies are framed with regards to indigenous communities. So I will leave that there. Thank you.
Our final presentation for the morning will be made by Dr. Neil Fenneran and Doctors Neil Fenneran and Christina Welch. And for those of us who have been at the conference over the last few years, we would know that they are almost features of this conference. So we want to really express our appreciation for what they have been doing, and I know that this morning they're going to give us some more food for thought. So Dr. Fenneran is at Cambridge, is a professor at Cambridge University, Fellow of Royal Anthropological Institute, and Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. He's also a reader in heritage and historical archaeology at the University of Western at Winchester, and he has worked as an archaeologist in the Caribbean for 26 years. Dr. Christina Welch lectures in religious studies at the University of Winchester as well in the UK. In addition, she runs online master's degree in deaf religion and culture. As an interdisciplinary scholar, she has research interest in Indigenous lifeways, community heritage, and education. Dr. Welch has published widely on the intersection of religion with visual and material culture. For the last 3 years, she has been working with Dr. Niall Finneran on research projects in London, in Barbados, and in St. Vincent. Ladies and gentlemen, Doctors Finneran and Welch.
Thank you very much. Just bear with us whilst we get the technology working. Our presentation's really visual.
Yeah, I'm afraid we kind of need pictures, but let me start off by saying thank you to everyone for having us back. It's a real privilege to be here again, to see so many old friends and so many new friends. We're talking about community heritage here and some of the tools and ideas that we've been discussing with people to help them bring their culture alive. What I'm going to do here is show you my first slide. The first slide here is a picture of us standing with some of the community from Greg's. Margaret Jackson was here yesterday. Some faces you might recognise if you could see this. Michelle Beach, for example, and Darky, of course, and Zoila. So there's a whole group. It's not working. There's no way there.
Okay, let me do it. This is not the one they Oh. Well, we could do that as well. From the 2 persons. We could do that.
Zoila, it was suggested that we go out for lunch and do Niall and Christina's presentation when we return. Yes, we can have a discussion with the 2 first presentations, and then we can sort this out and have it after lunch. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
We'll see you later.
Okay, so are there any questions, comments? We heard from Professor Nunez on the Garifuna enduring spirit in St. Vincent, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, Nicaragua, and the United States. She reminded us that because of the presence of the Garifuna culture and recognition that has been given, it is strong evidence of our enduring spirit. And we heard from Shanella Charles, who did What Connects Us, Indigenous Peoples, and she highlighted the importance of conferences where they give us the opportunity to meet. She also showed how important it is in selecting topics and in preparing our papers as they go a very long way in engaging persons, and made several references to some of the very important topics, such as art and culture, that were made. So, any questions?
sitting or just again solving that?
I would say generally they see themselves more, there's a umbrella Indigenous, but there's also language, right? So they will see themselves first more than language, they will see themselves as a Filipino, or what is young, or Latino. But they have been our evolution, yes. So they will see themselves, we have this about as different. So we all have different experiences, different geographies, but we have different experiences. The concept again is different. Because of the presence of so many groups, also because of the different geographies. And there are cultural exchange programs that have happened, particularly with the Sandoz community. Every year, the women from few communities in Canada come and they teach people here how to make Indigenous craft. And I asked women here how long she's been doing this, and she said about 25 years. So, even though that's not currently an area of research, that's something I would like to get more into in terms of these contemporary networks. We also network across borders in terms of conferences. We have people for rights, especially land rights. We have people from Suriname coming over to conferences, people from Grenadines and Suriname. So there's consciousness across borders of being more part of our communication, not in terms of the organization of Guyana, but of I think there was also a food building project as well. So they have been exchanges, but not on the official legacy, but some community that's not so much highlighted in the mainstream.
What about the Venezuela? Again, I do you share a border?
Yes. Yes. So in terms of how the Islamic community in Venezuela, so there's also a long history of that. So there's a, so what I mean is they see themselves more as a people rather than a nation state. So in 1969, there was a Muslim rebellion and an uprising that happened that included some indigenous people, but mostly landowning farmers. So in that case, indigenous people and that uprising back up to Venezuela, but they saw themselves as more aligned to Venezuela than the new Guyanese nation state. So that is because of the problem of borders all the time that we have, for work, because they're not in many cases included in the national economy, so they go cross over, they connect with other communities on that level as well. They go over seasonally for work in Suriname and Venezuela. So there's a lot of Nigerians that have this form of connection that makes them closer to countries that are at the border than the center of border.
Maybe I can add something that just sure.
Okay, great. We're hearing.
Okay. Well, I think to the ladies' answer. First of all, at this moment, we have to understand that is one of my experience. Many years involved in volunteer work through NGOs. And the situation is that we have the different nations. So we have the language barrier, one. And at NGO level, we do our best to communicate with at this moment. But if we would organize this conference in my village, it would be a situation not sufficient because we have the language barrier. You do not understand. And then you have the distance. But communicating with each other, I don't know how it has been, was always the case. Through river, through the sea, overseas, all the Caribbean states were communicating with each other through their leaders. A certain way because the people used to travel from one point to the other. And they were, because normally, naturally, we don't have borders as such as we see nowadays. You see, but there are the ownership
were respected, meaning that this is Locono area, this is Cariña area, and you just don't pass through that area without permission, because there were also people, groups, who will just kill. And we knew our own borders, you see. So participating in conferences like this asks more from us than just for you guys. You see, and we have to put more effort. That's why I am emphasis as a Christian leader. I emphasize to my people who want to become part of global society by participating in, for example, tourism. You have to study the structure of how the people who you are inviting or expecting to come to see what you have, how they think, and what their structure is. In that case, we can protect ourselves. So you want to do it sustainable, not for the others, but for us first of all. You see, so this development has more in it than, in fact, it's visible for us, especially when we are not familiar with the core of indigenous society. And with that, I mean also the Maroon society in Suriname. And probably the Garifuna society also. Even though we all are Garifuna, so we speak, your geographical setting where you live plays a big role. Every aspect of nature has its purpose and its role in how we live. But the base is one. We are human, we live collectively, but her village is, for example, at sea, as the Galilee situation is sea. My village is within the forest. So there are different, you see, geographical setting plays also a role. So let's look at all the things so we try to understand. I don't know anything, all the things, but I'm learning still. You see? And but it's, I think we have to communicate still with each other, but at some level other than the community directly.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions?
For Ms. Charles, yes, I'm from Diana. And when you mentioned Cannon is from my village, and as I recall, my mother, and I've lost the language because it died with me 2 years ago. That is why she gave me the name Savannah to do it. That's the only living thing in a few words that I can remember. Miss Lauren here, you also mentioned, she is still alive. She's now the principal of the Indigenous Institute, whereby she is carrying out the children learning the Mapuche language and also using her knowledge to disseminate that to the younger people so that they can relate and they can learn. And the traditional talking about medicine, they have a whole set of what we call garden of what we haven't heard anybody mention it here, Bina, the medicinal plant which can use for many purposes. But as the word buck, it struck me because that is still very much there right now living. And I think many of the young people,
Buck.
where you refer to as,
Yes,
where
yes.
you're stupid, so it can bring your self-esteem very down, especially so it's still used in many ways. I've lived through that because I was in secondary school in Georgetown, Mississippi, and it's still used by our own Guyanese sometimes. So it's not only something that it can, for the younger people, it can make them feel very young. I mean, very, very bad about themselves. as a teenager growing up in the city and it's being used, you know, it kind of makes you get very emotional and out of your community, because it's not what you're accustomed to within your community to be called any names. You don't see yourself as Buck, Amerindian, Indigenous, Victorian. You see yourself as really the living heritage culture, who you are, you brought up to. So when that word, I questioned it. There was another word I just mentioned, achiku. I was called that as achiku, Buck, you're stupid. And my mother was even beaten at school for speaking her language. That is why she said to me, you're the one you have to carry the truth to ensure that things happen. And I am glad that she gave me that word, Savannah. It outlines everything. And now we have a boat that is taking from one port to the other, named Savannah.
Okay.
So that is just the positive side of it.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I would just like to let you know is that that very word that made me decide to appreciate it. Because of the same shared experiences and the experiences of my family being, you know, going to Georgetown for secondary school and having people like shout at you from the buses and tell you go back to the bush and, you know, or you're stupid or, you know, because of those very experiences, I think everybody will talk about how we're very resilient as a people. And, you know, we use our adversity to move forward. And I have been to the community recently, and I am hoping to start a language revitalization project in my community.
Okay. Okay. I've never visited Guyana, but just from the persons I've met before, it's very surprising to hear you say something like that is happening in your era. It's quite surprising to me. Okay, I think you had your hand up, and then we can take you, sir.
Yeah, just a follow-up question on what you said. You can have literally legislate individual human beings, right? There are things that government can do that suppress that is great. For example, in Belize there was a young lady who literally got fired because she spoke Garifuna at the workplace. Let me repeat that. Like what, 4 or 5 years ago?
International.
Right? Where was the government? Now this is an international institution that has this community lose itself. Where was the government? Absent. And whatever token things they may have. In fact, I won't even give them that credit. The government was absent. But if the government had stepped in and say something, there would be some changes, because even up to now, that same word, that same Carib word, is being bandied out there. Right? I don't get offended regarding it anymore, because I realize that the people who are saying that are inadequate. So people who have that kind of a behavior, who will try to down press you, it's not about you. It's about them.
Self-worth.
Can I hear an amen?
Amen.
Thank you, I'm good.
All right, okay. Do you still?
Yeah, I don't want to say pretty much
Okay.
and it is correct, and it is, when the state governments are not part of it too. I mean, in our case in Dominica, it was good that our government, even when we wanted to move from Cari to Kalinago, just when Parliament soon afterwards passed it. More so changing our minister from Caribbean Field to putting on environment and rural transformation, that uplifting the rural, moving it from Caribbean Field to the upliftment of Kalinago, changing our Caribbean Reserve to Kalinago territory. That whole thing has brought us forward. So we've suffered the same thing at home. That I've suffered myself. I've been driving an expensive vehicle for somebody or some friend, and then somebody shouts out, "Carib!" I mean, they don't see me driving a big vehicle, that kind of thing. I remember working in the city once, and I'm going down the street, wearing a tie on, my long sleeves, and push you and say, "What kind of Carib wearing a tie?"
Oh.
And I'm talking about, I think somewhere in 2002.
Okay.
But so we went through that, but like brother said, you know, from the roots, it never bothered me. I saw it, I tell it, and I always tell the younger people, but you have to turn it into a negative. Because if you were so not important, nobody would see you. You know, so the fact that you see me on a bus or see me alone going down the road out of so many people, just me, see, I mean, to be important. You know, so I tell people to take it in that sense.
Yes.
And but we've done, I think we've done, yes, there's still, but nothing to bother us as much since we've got Kalinago pilots at home. We have the top surgeons in the hospitals at Kalinago now. You know, I mean, the fact that our professionals are right up front, I mean, how can you take care of stupid or look down on a Kalinago at home when, you know, he's the one going to put this knife on you at some point, you know? I mean, so that kind of thing, and it has helped us on prisoners at home, really, because now when this, now they don't say cat, when this says, we say Kalinago with that kind of, you know, a different feeling of pride. So I think it's, you know, that kind of involvement.
So the enduring spirit is there.
Yeah.
Okay.
My question will go forward to the way our dear sister would have summarized the last session, where the rubber used to roll. From my understanding of the conference here, we are fighting against many weapons, language, culture. Well, I didn't hear military language used this morning, but I know there were militarization that enabled us to vanish and be where we are today. But the question is, religion also plays a dynamic role. What was the original religion or the religious practice we had? Maybe if I may not answer, I know somewhere our doctors may. Thank you.
But for us, we have different religions, and we have our African spirituality. Our African spirituality is known as the road, and we have the Santeria, Adeobia, and different parts of the region of ours. So our spirituality is embedded in African spirituality, whereby we revere our ancestors. So we do, for people we don't believe that you die physically, we transcend into an ancestral world. That's our belief. Our ancestors have been over us as we live our daily lives. So hence in return, it's a symbiotic relationship. I give to you, and hence you give to me. So our spirituality is embedded in our ancestors. But we do have religion, we believe in religion, in European religion, that we do believe in our ancestors. That was the first religion. That's a cross-African spirituality, as opposed to Christianity. Christianity came later. And lastly, if you notice that there are monotheism religion, and there's also monotheism religion, which is about God. Monotheism and polytheism is about many gods. So the 5 main religions of the world is Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism. Islam is one God. Buddhism and Hinduism is polytheism religion. They believe in many gods. Right? But under monotheism, one God. Polytheism, several gods. That's a European construct. Right?
Okay. I think we can take, oh, sorry.
I just want to briefly comment, just to underscore how colonization has destroyed us. In terms of my own experience, having roots in a Lakota community, having a roots in a Lakota community that is much more governed by nature and geography. So even though I was raised Catholic, but I could still remember my mother, even from her
going here to ensure safe passage. So even though there was no standard thing, but there was still a collective memory of that kind of indigenous spirituality that is tied to nature, which I wasn't formally taught, but through stories and through practices that my grandparents did that I knew about, but not in a formal way, because our community was one of the first communities like post come in contact with Europeans, and Christianization started very early, so we lost that very early.
Okay. I think we have time for one more.
So that was, they were told very strongly that they could not go to any indigenous ceremonies or be known to do. So she said that the spirituality that was still practiced, and is still practiced today, but in those days, but today is a whole new volume. It has gone 350 years, where the bishop, Catholic bishop is there and practices, and is part of the ceremonies now. But in those days, that was not the case, and the church would actively pursue any person who was known to associate with Garifuna spirituality. So my mother said that she had to, and her mother had to send their offering for the ceremonies to a neighbor or something like that. That was the experience of what had happened due to religion from the Catholic Church.
30 seconds. We have evangelicals in Belize country actively right now doing that same thing. And I'm trying to invite them to have gifts, but they refuse to come. I don't know why. Carry on.
The reason why I selected to change the subject, the reason why I selected